Those of you who know me or who have been listening to this podcast for a while or who've been coming to writing group, you know that long drives are a regular part of my life. And no, I'm not about to tell you that I am in fact a truck driver, but I am a driver. And that is a real big part of my identity. I like fast cars. I'm calm and rather capable, though sometimes I do like to let an F-bomb or two fly. And I really do love road trips, especially if I'm the one driving. In fact, let's take that a step further. I only like road trips if I am driving alone for a long distance. So at least twice a month, I head up or down the California coast for a 6-hour plus drive. And you're probably wondering at this point, what does this have to do with writing? And in fact, it has so much to do with writing, so bear with me. When I'm preparing for a long drive, I gather my snacks, I line up some podcast episodes I want to listen to, and I make sure to set aside some time for quiet reflection, which for many of us is something that is all too rare in our everyday lives. I also like to set some writing goals for that road trip. And you're thinking, wait, how do you do that? Except those of you who've been around here for a while know that I use dictation while driving to trick my ADHD into chilling out and to smash my writing goals. And in fact, if you are a writing coach on demand person, or if you are taking my From Idea to Published in 6 Months masterclass, you are going to have so much more information on that whole method, which is actually super helpful. It's one of the biggest hacks. But this week's episode of the podcast is actually going to be about one of the major building blocks of that hack, because I'm breaking it down for you a little bit more. But before we talk about that, let's go back to this driving thing, because I do have a point I am trying to make, and I think this might blow your mind. So yes, the landscapes I see whizzing by, they're crucial, they're awesome, they're inspiring. The podcasts are really important too, though, because while I'm in my car, I'm a completely captive audience. And that's where I actually have the time to focus on something and get inspired. And that's where my creativity really gets awakened. And that's where I sometimes have these breakthroughs. And I hope that you're going to have a breakthrough too, listening to this, because yesterday while I was driving, the breakthrough I had was about identity. And I was listening to this Tony Robbins podcast. It's a little bit woo-woo for my taste, but sometimes Tony Robbins has some darn good points. And he was talking about how identity is more powerful than a simple goal. And he often repeats this concept, which is the strongest force in the universe is a human being living consistently with his identity. Now, this might sound simple. It might sound simplistic. It might sound like some kind of manifesting thing. But if you really think about it, this is kind of fascinating and really important. So, one of the reasons that I look forward to 6-hour drives instead of dreading them, in fact, probably the main reason, is because my identity is wrapped up in being a driver. Also, my identity in being an ADHD writer and a creative kind of gives me that idea of using that time to focus and to be productive while still being in movement. So in this case, my identity is really, really helping me. And often I tell my writers, hey, the first step in writing a book is becoming a writer, not just thinking you can do it, but really being a writer, saying you're a writer, being a writer, experiencing that. Because only through having an identity as a writer can you start to do all those tough things that it takes to be a writer without feeling that it's a hardship or a sacrifice. Once you are a writer, the things you're doing are going to have you being aligned with your identity, so there's less resistance. We've had a few podcast episodes on resistance, and this is one of those tricks that when you have resistance, it's because you're not aligned. So change your identity instead of changing your goal. I've spent years talking to writers in various stages of their writing career about the things that help them and the things that negatively impact them, the things that hurt them. And one of my writers was telling me that they have this really strong identity that's wrapped up in being a procrastinator. And they procrastinate in a whole lot of things in their life, from work to housework to everything else, to paying their taxes even. Has this writer finished his book? Obviously not, because going against his identity as a procrastinator, even though that's a negative identity, it's really, really hard to do. Now, Tony Robbins, in his podcast, just to illustrate this a little bit better, he used the example of a person who's established an identity as a reasonably fit person, right? They're kind of healthy. They eat right. They exercise enough to, kind of maintain a stable, good appearance and weight. Now, over the holidays, they start gaining weight. They let their workouts fall by the wayside because they're hanging out with family. And soon enough, that reasonably fit person identity is at odds with the body that they've now developed, right? They're a little bit softer. They've gained some weight. And now they realize that they've strayed too far from who they are as an identity. And that means that from one day to the next, they're going to start doing the things that are going to get them back to being reasonably fit. And it's not going to be a hardship. It's not going to take a whole transformation in their mindset because they already are that person. Okay, so far so good, right? But let's imagine that this person keeps on going. Their fitness level escalates until they're super fit, super healthy. They're looking better than ever. But here's the problem. If they don't manage to adjust their identity and level up to where their identity is of a very fit, very attractive person, their brain's going to start telling them, whoa, buddy, who do you think you are? And they may start skipping workouts and scarfing down the junk food again because they can safely do that and get back to who they fundamentally believe they are, which is a reasonably fit person, not over the top. Now, I know writers who say, oh, I don't really care how many readers I have. I write for myself. I'm a writer who is an artist and a creative, and I do it for my creativity. That's lovely. But do you think that the writer who says this is going to make the marketing efforts needed to sell more books? Absolutely not. And even if they somehow ended up being promoted, maybe by the efforts of a friend, or maybe someone said, hey, can you be on my podcast? And that resulted in more book sales. What do you think the chances are that that author who's writing just for themselves, or at least telling themselves that they are, what are the chances that they're going to sustain those sales numbers via their own efforts? Close to zero. So work on your identity. Figure out what kind of writer you want to be in your wildest dreams and start to be that. Don't just fake it till you make it. You're going to have to become it. Now, even though this type of thinking feels like it's a quantum leap, it is. It is a quantum leap. It is something that is a switch that you're going to flip and that you're going to change from one day to the next. And then it will take a time for your actions to help you to get to where your identity is. And I know that that's a really scary, bizarre thought. I know that many writers, and maybe you, are simply not ready for this. I believe that it is the sort of thing that happens overnight. And when it does lead to great things. But in the meantime, for the timid, there is kind of the opposite tack. And that is breaking it all into bite-sized chunks. And this is something that I talk about a lot because many writers, especially beginner ones, feel like they're not ready to invest too much time or energy, but they still kind of want to move forward and explore this writing thing. Now, I don't think this is a great strategy for the long term because I really do want you to level up and do this thing if it's important to you. But if you're playing around with writing or if you're still deciding and you're just breaking it down into smaller units is actually a great thing to do. So whether you're doing poems or writing sprints or short stories or scenes, all of these things are going to help you to flex your creativity and writing muscles. They're all going to move you forward. They're all going to help you to practice your craft. And that's why in this week's episode of this How to Be an Author podcast, I want to be talking about writing scene by scene. Definitely, if you're considering investing in the From Idea to Publish in 6 Months masterclass, you're going to have plenty of instruction and worksheets on how to do this. But this podcast is really a great start. So let's get started on talking about writing a novel scene by scene. And we're going to be talking about the why and the how and what a scene is, what a scene isn't. And I think that even if you are an experienced writer who's been doing this for a while, this is a really good refresher that might actually cause some real writing breakthroughs. So let's get started. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. So welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. I am writing coach Karena Akhavein, and my passion in life is helping writers like you level up in their writing careers, help their technical writing skills, and get their mindset in the right place, because being a writer is not an easy thing to do. And I think that approaching it from a holistic point of view is really the best way of being successful in the long run. But today we're going to be talking about a tiny part of this whole writing success thing, and that is writing scene by scene. I legitimately consider this a writing hack, even though for me it's kind of second nature. But not all authors write this way, and today is me trying to convince you to give it a try, especially if you're a new writer. But even if you are a writer who's been working for a while and looking for something new that's going to boost their creativity and their productivity, writing scene by scene can be a great idea. So let's talk about why writing a novel scene by scene is an awesome thing to do. First of all, in terms of clarity and organization, I think that breaking a novel into scenes really helps you to clarify the plot. Because when you're writing scenes the right way, each scene has a purpose. So we're going to be talking about that a whole lot today. But really, it helps you to avoid any mushy, needless part in the plot that's going to ruin your pacing. It makes it easier to make your story streamlined and effective. And this is really important. Also, when you're writing scenes, it allows you to really focus on a specific aspect of the story or of your writing. And that way you're not tackling this enormous unit, which is your entire book. That can be intimidating. Writing scene by scene gives you a new opportunity to start over every time. So if you're trying to up your poetry or your description or your dialogue or improve any of those things, writing scene by scene means that you don't feel like you have to scrap everything and start over. It means that each scene is a new opportunity, and then you can revise the scenes you've already written to make them come up to snuff with the new ones that you've figured out are better. Revisions are definitely easier when you're revising scene by scene, because you can focus on whether this one unit of storytelling is working. And I had mentioned pacing. Definitely by writing scene by scene, you can control the pacing of your novel so much more, because the scene itself needs to work and it needs to fit within your novel. And I think that it's a super helpful thing to tweak the pacing scene by scene, which then leads to overall better pacing. Also, it helps you to really delve into your characters when you're writing scene by scene, because you can make your characters more three-dimensional, more developed by being able to focus on their micro emotions in these scenes and on looking to see if each scene actually expresses their motivations, see if that character is actually going through the character arc that they need to be going through. But I think that examining how a character interacts with others or goes through their scene is really going to be super helpful to you. Okay, first, before we go on more about writing scene by scene, let's talk about what is a scene. A scene in a book is a unit of storytelling in which something happens. And each scene has some elements that I think are pretty non-negotiable as far as scenes go. I often talk about the 5 W's, and that's definitely a good start: the who, what, why, where, when. But each scene really definitely should have a setting. So whether you delve deep into the description of the setting or not, it's good for your reader to know where this scene is taking place and when it's taking place. The setting really helps you to establish a mood and an atmosphere for the scene, so it's a really helpful thing. And I've talked before about white box syndrome. You don't want your readers to be reading along and thinking to themselves, God, I really can't picture where this is happening. I'm just seeing my characters floating around in a white box. We definitely do not want that. I've talked about characters. Obviously, you need characters in a scene. Many newer writers will write an entire scene or something that they think is a scene that is just pure description. And I love description. I love this beautiful poetry of describing, where we are and the atmosphere and the things that are there. However, I really want a character in each scene, because if you don't have a character in the scene, nothing is happening. So the characters in the scene are going to be showing their personality. They're going to be moving through the world of the novel, and they're going to be doing things maybe with other people. When you have other people in the scene, or, a environment in the scene, that means that you're going to have some kind of conflict, right? Each scene kind of has some kind of problem or challenge, which is either caused by another character or caused by the elements that are present within the scene. This is what's driving the action and advancing the plot. You may have some dialogue in your scene. This is not always necessary, but I think it's cool when you have two people in a scene, you probably do want at least a couple lines of dialogue. And in my idea to published masterclass, I definitely have a lot of tips on how to figure out whether you have enough dialogue, too much dialogue, and how to tweak your dialogue. But definitely having dialogue in a scene really helps you to have some dimension to it. And of course, you're going to want some kind of action. Even if the characters are just speaking to each other, I want to see them kind of moving and not frozen in the middle of the setting. And of course, you're going to want some emotion. The emotion, the things that are experienced by the characters, this really helps to build the tension, to explore that conflict, and to make that story more engaging. I've really found that so many newer writers have stories that are full of plot points and things happening, whereas new, more experienced writers have stories that are more full of emotion. So less things are technically happening, but more things are happening inside the character's mind. And that really helps the reader to dive in and feel invested. Some of you may be wondering, how many scenes do I need in my novel? My answer is going to be a little bit glib, as many as you need. And that's true. Typical novels probably have anything from 30 to over 100 scenes. And depending on how complex your plot is, how many subplots you have, how many characters, how long your novel is, what kind of pacing you have, that's really going to impact how many scenes you have. So in a general sense, your scenes are a unit of narration where something happens. And, a scene will change when characters change location, for example, or when we are jumping to a different time period, or when we are meeting someone new. All of these things are going to have us starting a new scene. And for those of you who are still kind of puzzling over how to create an outline, your outline could be just a list of scenes just being things to happen to get your plot from point A to point B. Very, very important. The important thing is to ensure that each scene advances the story in some way. And so many writers that I coach, I'll look at a scene and they love the scene because it's a beautiful scene and it's set somewhere fabulous and the characters are, there that they like and all that stuff. And I say, the scene doesn't actually advance the story. And they just get really defensive because they're like, but I love this scene. It's so pretty. Sure, I understand you don't want to lose the scene. Then make it advance the story. Sometimes that's as simple as adding in a sentence or two, something that's going to make this scene useful. Very, very important. When you're writing a scene and you're kind of wondering how long should this scene be, there are things that you're going to think about. So first of all, you're going to be thinking, I talked about each scene having a purpose. Well, sometimes the purpose of a scene is going to impact the length of the scene. So if you have a scene that is introducing a character, that's one thing, right? Or if it's revealing one piece of information, that's another thing. Or if it's creating tension, or if it's advancing the plot. All of these are different scenes with different purposes, and that will impact the length of the scene. Also, pacing is really, really important, right? If you want a scene that's going to be short, explosive, and active, well, that is going to help your pacing and maintain that reader engagement, because then they're going to go into a scene that's longer and it's going to be more about description and the fallout from that explosive scene. All of this makes a lot of sense. There are scenes that have more action and others that have more dialogue. And then there are scenes that are more introspective. So think about pacing-wise and information-wise how these scenes work and how long they're going to be. When authors ask me what's too long and what's too short, I say that scenes should be long enough to achieve the purpose that you've set out for them, but short enough so that you can make a smooth transition to the next scene and that it doesn't drag. Because if your scene kind of drags on for too long and you move to another place and your characters are traveling during the scene, I kind of feel like you lose the pacing and you lose the engagement for the reader. So let's talk about the step-by-step how to write a scene in a novel. This is really, really important. And the scenes are really important because writing scene by scene is how I do my dictation method. So as I said, you're going to write down a list of scenes and you're going to write down those key elements, the 5 W's or, the settings, the characters, the purpose, all of that stuff. And that way you're going to be able to write this scene via dictation if you want to, or in the course of a writing sprint if you want to. You're not going to have to sit there and wonder once you know what goes into the scene, it's almost going to write itself. So step by step, how do you write a scene in a novel? Number 1 is the purpose. What is the scene achieving? What is important here? What is the reader going to take away from the scene? How are things going to be different after this scene than they were at the beginning of the scene? So that's definitely number 1. What is this scene going to do? Number 2, you're going to choose the setting. And not just the setting, but how am I going to describe the setting? How much of it do I need to describe? But why is this setting crucial to the scene? How does it impact the scene? And how can I really make this setting come to life for my reader? Then we're going to introduce the characters. So who are the characters who absolutely need to be in the scene? We need to give enough information about them so that the reader understands A, that they're there, and B, why they're there, and C, what their relationships are and why they're important. So many newer writers will have a bunch of characters in a scene because they love these adventure novels where there's a whole group of people. Here's my little surprise tip. Even if your scene technically realistically has a bunch of people in it. Like, let's imagine that your scene is you have a whole group of characters, like maybe 20 characters or so, and they are voyaging to some faraway kingdom. And in this scene, they have all stopped and they're all around the campfire. And a newer writer might be tempted to have a bunch of characters looking at each other, rolling their eyes, shrugging their shoulders, throwing in some, little explanations or expletives or pieces of dialogue. You don't need to do that. You don't need to do that. If your characters are around the fire, why don't you choose the 2 or 3 crucial characters that need to be in the scene for what it's going to do and let the other ones fade into the background? You can almost let the reader forget they're there or just establish that they are there, but that they're doing something else in the background while your characters are speaking or acting over to the side. And that really helps a lot. Now, establish a conflict. This is the next step. You need to have some kind of problem or challenge that your characters are facing. So whether they're going to be dealing with that challenge via action or via words or via their emotional working something out in their head, they are moving forward because of this conflict, whether it's conflict with themselves, with their environment, or with somebody else. This is going to be really crucial in the scene. Now, think about whether you need dialogue. Are the characters going to have a conversation? What kind of information are they going to be revealing about their personality, about their motivations, about their goals, and about the relationship that they have with the person they're speaking to? While you're writing this dialogue, think about the physical events that are occurring and think about the action verbs that'll really help you to make these events more striking so that the reader can understand what's going on without you having to go into it in too much detail. Definitely the emotion is crucial. Really showing the emotions experienced by the characters is going to add the tension that makes a scene more engaging and that really makes a reader want to be more engaged and more involved in what they're reading. And then you need to figure out, how am I going to end this scene? Some writers end up just ending the scene before it's done or letting it kind of grind down to a stop. And we really don't want that. We want us to have a real ending, just like a book. We need a real ending. So whether it's a little mini cliffhanger or whether something gets resolved or whether there's some event that forcefully leads us into the next scene, you need a real ending to your scene to keep the reader excited about what they're reading. And remember, writing a scene is not something that you just do once and that you forget it. It might take some revisions to get it right. And you might move on to the next scene and be like, oh, okay, this scene is way better than the previous scene. That's great. It's great when you realize that, hey, I wrote a scene that wasn't really working. It wasn't great, but my next scene can be better. And then I can go back and see how I can improve the previous scene. That is part of the writing process. Let me tell you, let me wrap it back up to that whole driving and dictating thing. Yesterday, I wrote a couple scenes or I dictated a couple scenes that frankly, they're not my best work. I finished writing them or finished dictating them and I kind of came away from it going, frankly, there's something that's not working here. There's something that I'm not really loving. And I have kind of a thought as to what it probably is. I think I'm not bringing my setting into the scene in crucial ways. I think that my dialogue is maybe too overwrought. And I think that my characters aren't really quite sure about their emotions at this point. And I do want my characters to be a little bit more decisive or at least struggling more with two different courses of action, for example. But I also feel confident that at least I got these scenes down. I can use some of it. And tomorrow's another day. I can totally tweak those scenes because that's what I do. I'm a writer. That's my identity. I'm not a perfect writer. I'm a working writer who's trying to do their best and who's trying to share her mistakes and her triumphs with you who are also a writer. So you see how this identity thing works? I think that it can really work in our favor. And I think that writing scenes and scene by scene is that little hack that really is going to help you to progress more than you ever thought possible. So let me know what you think about this whole writing scene by scene thing. If you're a writing coach on demand person, you're going to be getting a bunch of bonus materials this week about all of that. You're going to be able to book your office hours. And if you're not in writing coach on demand, you might want to consider signing up for it because for less than $1 a day, you get to have all of this extra motivation, information, mindset stuff with your writing coach. You get to make office hours and you also get 20% off of any purchase on the site, which includes From Idea to Published in 6 months, which is my massive masterclass that helps you to go from simply having an idea and not really knowing what to do with it to holding your published book in your hand within 6 months without feeling like you're going to go crazy, burn out, or lose your mind. I think it's really important. So head over to creativeandwritingcoach.com for the Writing Coach on Demand program. You can also navigate over to the courses from there or go directly to online courses for writers.com and you will see the From Idea to Publish course right there. So in the meantime, I am really looking forward to hearing from some of you this week as you react to what you heard on the episode. Feel free to shoot me an email or chat with me during office hours or whatever you want to do. And I am looking forward to being with you all next week as I come up with another fantastic episode of the How to Be an Author podcast, breaking down all the things you need to know to be a better writer, to be the author you always wanted to be without going completely mad. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.